Hello, everyone. My name is Weston Dell. I'm happy to be presenting to you today. Welcome to our presentation. We are going to be talking about tracking today. So without further ado, let's get started. The title of our presentation is Tracking the Good, the Bad, and What We Can Do About It. Let's jump into it. So let's first talk about what is tracking. So tracking is grouping students by some measure of ability. That's sometimes based off of a test. Sometimes that's based off of a prior class. Maybe it's based on an IQ score. Basically, tracking is grouping students by some ability and then placing them in separate classes by that ability. Now, we as educators and the general field of education should care about this for three reasons. First off, tracking is pervasive in the United States. Now, it's hard to define what precisely tracking is and hard to measure it across schools in the US as a result. But we do know that 70% of schools in the US offer at least one AP classroom. That's high schools. So that gives us at least a proxy measurement for the amount of tracking that's done here in the US. Secondly, tracking has been shown to create inequality between students. And that's something we should care about. And there's a real con of tracking. Here's how the story typically goes. Those students in the higher track classes benefit from greater resources. They benefit from a more rigorous curriculum. They typically benefit from a better teacher, and they typically benefit from better peers in their classroom. On the flip side, those students in the lower tracks are hurt by more behavioral issues, by less resources, by lower expectations, and by a relatively worse teacher. Now, that creates clear inequality, which is concerning, especially considering the fact that racial minority groups tend to be more concentrated in those lower track classes. It's concerning for that reason, and so is a real con of tracking. I should say, though, that there are some real benefits that come out of tracking, too, that may explain why it's so pervasive here in the US. Tracking by ability grouping makes it easier for the teacher to differentiate instruction. It makes on-level instruction more able and available, and we can see potential for academic improvements as a result. And it's even been shown that motivation sometimes is improved in a tracked class. So it's a complicated issue, and we're going to dive into this topic by looking at five specific things within tracking. So forms of tracking, effects of tracking on student motivation, effects of tracking on student achievement, detracking, and implications at the middle school level. So I'm going to begin by talking about forms of tracking. Now, as I said before, tracking is hard to define, but we want to have a picture of what this looks like in the United States. So rather than look at the US as an entire country, what we decided to do is look at one specific state, in this case, North Carolina, take a real in-depth look as to what they're doing, and use that as kind of the sample for the entire country. So the research article that we looked at did a real deep dive into North Carolina high schools and what tracking looks like there. Now, most schools had what we would typically define as the common tracked system. You have honors, non-honors, and your four core subjects of social studies, English, math, and science. And the curriculum is greatly basically the same across most high schools. And that's because the state has the same standards for graduation. So it makes sense that most students are taking Algebra 1 or taking biology, those typical classes. Now, the author did look at four specific variables, and these are the four variables that most of these studies look at. That's selectivity, which is the degree of homogeneity within a class. So how much variability within an honors class is there? Electivity, how much ability do students have to choose their honors class? Inclusiveness, meaning what is the percentage of students that are on more of a college preparatory track versus not? So it's looking at overall percentages between high track, low track, and then scope. So if a student is in an honors math class, does that mean they're in an honors science class? What does that look like across subjects? Now, the author found that although schools have a very common structure of classes for tracking, the ways in which students are placed in those honors classes is a real mixed bag. Now, most schools have what's called a parent-student informed choice, which basically means that, they say that the students and parents have the ultimate say, but schools vary widely in the objective measurements, meaning like the test scores, previous class performances. There's not a standardized measure for it. And even on those more subjective measurements, teacher evaluations, parental influence on all these factors, it's not clear. So as a result, there's a wide range of tracking done in that state, which has conclusions for this country as a whole. Now, there was a research article done, a major groundbreaking research article done on how these factors actually play out and affect student achievement and inequality in the classroom. And the author came to three major conclusions. First off, inflexibility in track systems led to worsened academic outcomes. So that really relates to the electivity part of this study. So if a student feels kind of trapped in their course progression, if there's not much movement between high track and low track, that typically results in worsened outcomes. Now, when schools tend to have high inclusivity, when there was a greater percentage of students in those high track classrooms, we saw better academic outcomes. That makes sense. That's kind of what we're looking for in, by putting students in these higher classes with more rigorous outcomes. What was interesting though is with high or low inclusivity, there was a magnified social psychological effect that relates more to the stigma of these tracking systems. So, students in high tracks may feel kind of elite or, entitled in that way, or maybe those students in low tracks feel stigmatized or, less off. Maybe I'm not as smart as these other kids. We see those social psychological effects play out when there's an imbalance in the percentage of high track versus low track students. So a conclusion from this is if students want to improve productivity and reduce inequality while tracking, if schools want to do this, they should, one, maximize flexibility in tracking, allow students to go up and down as best we can. Two, mitigate social psychological effects through multiple means. Schools can really do this through the culture that they have within that environment. And three, really aim to have students take high track classes as much as possible. We see real benefits from students being in high track classes. So we want to try to get as many students up in there as we can. That's all I have for this part, and I'm going to toss it over to Catherine for this next part.
Hi, my name is Catherine Gale, and I'm going to go ahead and talk about the effects of tracking on student motivation. So student motivation, we know from the literature, is very highly tied to academic achievement, and it's influenced by a variety of socioeducational factors, which you can see here on the screen. So these include quality of teaching, level of discipline, peer effects, achievement standards, among other things. And for higher track classrooms, we tend to assume that the quality of teaching and the resources are greater in these higher track classrooms. The level of discipline, it tends to be more structured, so you have less disciplinary issues. And so from these factors, you might expect that student motivation in higher track classrooms is increased in contrast to their lower track peers. However, what we actually find from the literature is the opposite. So contrary to what might be expected, research actually shows that placement in advanced tracks, so those higher track classrooms, produces a negative effect on students' self-concept, which is tightly tied to motivation. This is from two different studies, Lessard et al. And Trotwein et al. Lessard looked at a sample of Canadian high school mathematics students, whereas Trotwein looked at German ninth graders, and both found evidence of this thing called a contrast effect. So a contrast effect essentially means that students, instead of comparing themselves to their school as a whole, so comparing themselves to students in other classes, they tend to compare themselves to their immediate environment instead. So they're only comparing themselves to the peers that they have in their immediate classroom. And so for higher track students, this means that high ability students are comparing themselves to other high ability students, maybe for the first time, and their then perceived competence in the subject then decreases because they're comparing themselves to other students who tend to do very well. Whereas lower track students are comparing themselves to same ability peers rather than their high ability classmates. And so they actually experience higher levels of self-concept and perceived levels of competence. And this then means that this contrast effect, so comparing themselves to their immediate peers, is actually greater than the stigmatization effect that lower track students may experience from feelings of like embarrassment or something from being placed in a lower track. And then this will lead us into our second point, which is the recommendations that the authors have for students, for classroom teachers, and what they can do in their classroom in order to promote the achievement and motivation of all of their students, regardless of track. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. I was just having issues getting it to flip slides while I was screen sharing. And so this is this slide here. So there are 3 recommended areas for intervention from Lessard and Trotwine. The first is to focus on discipline and classroom management in lower track classrooms in particular, because the level of disruption tends to be higher in those classrooms. So you tend to have more behavioral challenges there. Creating a more structured environment then helps students be able to learn better and focus better on the material. So that actually increases their motivation. For higher track classrooms, focusing on promoting a positive classroom culture will help reduce those contrast effects, kind of the big fish in a small pond thing that Lessard describes for higher ability students, than feeling more self-conscious about their ability in comparison to their high track peers. And then finally, for both high track and low track students, emphasizing a classroom discussion culture, so promoting discussion and open conversation in your classroom, has a positive effect on motivation for both tracks. And it's particularly significant for low track classrooms. So when you promote discussion in your low track classrooms, that actually increases student motivation even more significantly than in higher track classrooms.
Hey, I'm Caroline, and I'm going to be taking a look at student academic achievement within the frame of tracking. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So I think it's important to begin by defining academic achievement within the academic literature that we've been looking at. So in order to quantify academic achievement, researchers are going to be looking at students' GPAs and standardized test scores, which obviously isn't all encompassing of students' academic achievement, but those are the parameters that we're looking at when we are discussing academic outcomes for students. And within that, the data is suggesting that students in higher tracks do have higher academic achievement resulting. So the higher track you're in, the more likely you are to achieve higher academic standardized test scores or GPAs. So that does lead to the issue of inequity between tracks. The researchers point to higher quality of instruction, more experienced teachers, the ability to get through more curriculum in a year, all as reasons why this could be, as well as greater background knowledge and the unequal distribution of resources that does favor higher tracks. So, however, to say that the research just suggests that tracking has negative impacts on student achievement isn't to look at the full picture. So in order to do that, I'm going to pull in a couple different other studies to look at. The first one involves peer effects, which is essentially externalities from your other peers or your classmates, how their experiences blend into your own experience. So you can have academic or social peer effects that are positive or negative. We're going to be looking at academic peer effects. So that's, for example, a student who's behaviorally impacts this teacher and takes them away from the class. That's going to be an example of a negative peer effect. But you can also have a lot of positive collaboration, which is a positive peer effect between students. So you can see on this slide, research has proven that having higher peers with higher ability peers increases achievement. Adding lower ability peers to lower ability students also increases that academic achievement. However, if you have a lower ability student, add more higher ability peers and take away lower ability peers that are of a similar level as the student, that actually will decrease the academic achievement for the original student. So this is actually in favor of grouping students by ability. And the research suggests that starting out with similar foundations allows teachers to customize that curriculum to better fit the needs of the students within that class. Another study I do want to look at is the Duflo experiment, which took place among primary schools in Kenya. They actually had a number of primary schools that they were splitting from one class into two, half of which was randomized and half of which was tracking. And the research was overwhelmingly in favor of the tracked classes having higher scores among all levels. So in the higher level class and the lower level class, there were statistically significant higher level results in academic achievement. And it also mirrors studies that have been conducted at the high school level in the United States as well. Again, to emphasize, this was actually an experiment, a randomized experiment and not a study. So they were a little bit more cognizant of which students were being tracked where, which is another dimension to add to this tracking debate, is how students are placed in the tracks in the first place. Because it was an experiment and not a study of a already preset tracking structure, that could be something that could explain these results. But as a whole, the research on student academic achievement and tracking has a number of varied results using nonlinear models, and taking a look at how the tracking structures were put in place are two ways that can kind of explain the contradiction within the results that you see. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jack now.
Hello, my name is Jack Mayer, and I'm going to be talking about detracking. So hopefully at this point you got to the point where you see tracking as a more complicated thing than you did at the beginning of the presentation. Detracking is the idea of like removing tracking from a school. So taking away the differentiated class structures. The main arguments for this is in terms of equality. So tracking results in unequal outcomes for students in different tracks. The main argument against it is that it will negatively impact students in the higher tracks. The parents get mad about that for the students in the higher tracks. Most of the literature on this is actually on the political battles around detracking instead of actually examining case studies, because this is very rare that this actually happens in schools. It's also not clear, there's no clear answer whether it's going to work or not for a given school, although by the end I'll try to give some factors that could influence that. So one article we looked at was Gamorn and Weinstein. They looked at 3 different high schools that had detracked. So all the students were in the same level and saw the same curriculum throughout their 4 years. For 2 of these schools, it was largely unsuccessful. Some of them citing that it is incredibly difficult to address the wide range of student needs in the classroom. The third one was successful. They saw an overall increase in the number of students engaged and in general student achievement. Gamorn and Weinstein cited several factors for why this worked. One of them was that their curriculum, they switched it from being linear and sequential in terms of like everything like built on each other. You can think of like a standard algebra class, and they switched it to be more focused on complex projects that wove together a bunch of different topics from a class. They also had tutoring available after school and on Saturdays, so students, when they would come up against a skill they didn't know that they needed for their project, they could go get remediation on that. They also cited having a visionary principal and buy-in from the teachers as incredibly important. Okay, in terms of detracking, multiple authors also talked about how detracking like plays in with equity. So Yanazawa looked at how can we reduce the racial and SES gap in track enrollments. And so they looked at what happens if you just allow for open enrollment, so any student can place into whatever the track they choose to. Unfortunately, what they saw is this was insufficient to close those gaps. They said that there were still cultural and social barriers that were in the way. So it's not enough just to open up class tracks. You have to actually push students into those tracks to get them to get rid of those gaps. Another study looked at like how do schools address, like often either tracking or detracking will be aimed at achieving a higher level of achievement. What they found is that advantaged schools generally offer more tracks, and they'll try to get students to a higher level of achievement by adding a bunch of different tracks above the level of where a student would typically be. Whereas disadvantaged schools try to just use one track and kind of move that up. So for the goal of algebra for all, a detract or a disadvantaged school would just put all their 8th graders in algebra, whereas a more advantaged school generally would have different levels of like geometry and honors geometry available to freshmen to like have the incoming freshmen placed into those different classes. Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk about is the Southside High School. So this is often cited as a very effective example of detracking. What they did is they opened up the IB curriculum to all students who wanted. In this graph, you see the enrollment in those IB classes over the years. And then the teachers specifically pushed it on their students. So they really encourage students to go and take these harder classes. What they saw was that as the enrollment increased, the scores, the average scores they were getting on the tests did not decrease, and actually they increased. So now they were having hundreds more kids take the exams, but also the percentage of kids taking the exams that passed increased as well. So overall, it's just a very good outcomes. One thing they talked about a little bit, which ties into the other successful model, was that it involves longer term projects and more engaging curriculum instead of just sequential topics.
Hi, I'm Grace Kaiser, and I'm going to be talking to you about tracking implications at the middle school level specifically. So tracking is less frequent at the middle school level. Defenders of tracking are those often related to the academically able who are performing exceptionally well. Opponents of tracking at the middle school level are often those who have seen the inequities and inadequacies that lower tracked groups run into. So tracking is pretty universal. It does happen in different countries and cultures. Some countries such as Austria, Germany, Hungary, and the Slovak Republic have started tracking it as young of 10 years of age. And so in a study done that looked specifically at Japanese children and American children who were tracked, it was seen that the Japanese children had a 10-point increase in IQ levels over the American children. This actually was not due to tracking at all, though. This was deemed to be due to how the Japanese children had an internalized belief of when approaching a difficult problem or situation, they showed more perseverance, basically, and grit than the American children. So the difference in IQ level was proven to not have anything to do with tracking. Tracking is disproportionately affecting African American, Latino, and students of lower SES backgrounds. They are overrepresented in lower tracked groups in comparison to their representation in the school as a whole. So middle school tracking does perpetuate racial, social, and cultural divides, which relates, as we know, to the inequitable access to education. So tracking also poses an added difficulty to English language learners' educations. They are overrepresented in the lower level classes and underrepresented in the upper level classes. It's shown that they are not receiving the full academic content that they should and deserve to be receiving, and it negatively affects their graduation rates. So in a study done in 2016 by Umansky, it was showing that English language learners are actually excluded from some ELA classes. And she found 4 specific reasons for this. And it was prior academic achievement, institutional constraints, such as maybe a school not having enough funding or such, their English proficiency, and just their English language learner classification itself. So what can we as teachers do about tracking, whether our schools have it or not? We can make sure that materials and resources are evenly distributed to all groups, regardless of level. We can advocate for students to move to higher tracked classes when appropriate. We can give equal support and importance to each class. This includes equal challenging and engaging content, using the same high-risk learning and teaching strategies in our classrooms with all classes, having comprehensive and challenging content, and devoting the same time and energy into planning for all of our classes. Also, we can create in our classrooms an atmosphere of belonging to help with that student self-perception. If you really just boil it all down, teachers can not lower their expectations based on a student's perceived academic ability. So here are our references. We want to thank you all for watching our video, and please let us know what questions you have. We're happy to answer all of them. Thank you very much.